Hello, everyone. Well, I've said this before, but if you're just watching the show for the first time, I love bios. Bios could be so much fun. So this is about my guest, okay? She was born in Vancouver and grew up in Bohemia, lived in various places such as New York City, Spain, Roberts Creek, BC, and she was part of Vancouver punk scene. Oh my goodness. She studied literature at UBC and the University of Toronto, where she lived at Massey College, founded by the great writer Robinson Davies. She is the author of All Possible Worlds, Utopian Experiments in British Columbia, Hollywood, Utopia, and a novel called Spin the Bottle. Now she runs a YouTube channel devoted to 17th century history and is working on the biography of King James II and the 7th. Got that right? Yeah. Anyway, I had to read it out because it's so much fun. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to speak with Justine Brown. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Nancy. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I was excited about this. I love, as I said, I love bios. They reveal a lot about a person, and it's not a long bio, right?
What we choose to emphasize, right?
So. Yeah, exactly. So let's go back to Vancouver.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now tell me about the punk scene, because I find that fascinating.
Yes. My family and I were living all over the world, and then we ended up back in Vancouver when I was 12 years old, and it was just that year that I happened to meet some people from the punk scene of the late 70s, early 80s. So I was 12, and most of the people I met were more like 19 or, up to 25 years old. So it was kind of a, looking back on it, it was kind of a risky proposition in some ways, but an exciting one at the same time.
Right.
So I fell in with this crowd some musicians who moved in across the street. And they were, as it turns out, they were associated with bands like the Modernettes, Art Bergman. There was a less well-known band called Active Dog. And then, so I started going to clubs and, all these places like the Windmill, the Smiling Buddha, some like legendary spots, a lot of like gigs. Some of the more interesting gigs were in the warehouses around Vancouver, down on the docks and things like that. And it was definitely an exciting time because it was just the cusp of something, and it was a very thrilling, for a young teenager.
I would think so, sure. Yeah. Especially with having people older than you, allowing you to be part of the scene with them, right?
Yes, yeah. At the time, I mean, there were a few kids who were at the edges of things, and and then I went to University Hill High School for a little while, which is in UBC.
Yeah.
And then I ended up going to alternative school, my school was City School, but you might be familiar with, some people might know Ideal School, or
right.
They were experimental small schools that were founded in the 70s, but sort of kept going through the 80s. And I think the City School still exists now. But anyway, the kids there, I found a crowd of kids my age who were also into punk music. So, I had a little crowd of people who were closer to my age as well. So that was probably a little more safe, actually.
So why did your family move around so much?
My mother is a novelist. Her name's Joan Haggerty, and she was, in another kind of, like, when I say I grew up in Bohemia, I mean literally, I mean the sort of artistic kind of community.
Yeah, because it wasn't a capital. Yeah, you didn't capitalize
Some
it.
people wonder if that's what they used to call the Czech Republic, Bohemia. But I think what happened was that the term Bohemia was associated with like kind of a gypsy way of life.
Yeah.
And that's, so anyway, it's a little joke. But my mother was kind of more she was associated with a very adventurous group of people in the 60s and 70s. So she moved to London when she was quite young, and then we lived in Spain, in the Balearic Islands, which is a group of islands. The most famous one is Ibiza, off Barcelona, and a lot of hippies were there at the time. So we lived there because my mom had a Canada Council grants, and we could just about scrape by on living in Spain at the time.
At the same time, like, I would think, what an education for a young person, right?
Yes, yeah. I mean, I often think back, like, honestly, I have quite, in some ways, I have quite a traditional and conservative instinct. So I think of kids actually probably need more structure than maybe me or other similar hippie kids actually got. But on the other hand, it was very exciting and interesting. You met a lot of extraordinary people. So when I think back, would I trade, like, I'm kind of on the edge about whether I would trade it in or not, but I managed to make it this far. So right.
Yeah, well, it is part of who you are, right?
That's true. Yeah.
So
I feel like today I can sort of talk to just about anybody as a result of this
Yeah, I
background.
think that's wonderful. Yeah. So now let's talk about some of your works. Author of All Possible Worlds. So tell me about that.
Okay, so that book is an account of utopian communities in British Columbia. So by this, my definition of a utopian community is usually a small, somewhat isolated community. It can be isolated physically, or it could be isolated in some other way, ideologically, even potentially, which is a utopian community tends to be animated by some ideal. So that could be just communalism itself. It could be, there are some, interesting places these days that you use environmentalism as an animating ideal. Sometimes it could be a kind of cult, really. So sometimes we're dealing with things which are, some of them work out better than others, let's put it that way, because usually a cult is organized around a single charismatic individual who, often turns out to be trouble for the adherents. But my observation was that since the 19th century, since the arrival of Europeans in British Columbia, there has been like quite a tradition of utopian communities of one kind and another, and sort of going from a community. Actually, the first community I covered in the book was called Metlakatla, which was a native. It was a community for natives in Prince Rupert. And it was organized by an Anglican clergyman, but it had a very sort of special character. And it was meant to be quite a protective place. It's an interesting place to look into, actually. Okay. There's still a place off Prince Rupert called Metlakatla, and that's what it was just named after. But yeah, so I started with that community and kind of went up to, I included things like, there's a famous character called Brother 12, who was a sort of cult leader from the 20s. He had a community in the Valdez Island, which is just between in the Gulf Islands. Mm-hmm. And I included communes of the 60s, and also famously there's a Finnish utopian community called Sointula. So yeah, the gist of that book was, that there's something about British Columbia in particular, perhaps simply because of the amount of space that's available, or at least, that people try things. Yes. Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because I grew up back east, and the first people that, like, I remember people talking about moving out to BC, for the scene, whatever they meant by that, right? Yeah. I didn't know what the scene was because I wasn't into it. but it was kind of interesting that it was always BC was the place that a lot of young people, hippie types, I grew up in the hippie era, so where the hippies wanted to be, right?
Right. Yeah. I mean, British Columbia is the California of Canada, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know, it's the place where people go where the weather's a little bit more forgiving.
Yeah.
The place where people go to experiment and to, you know, to try things out. And I guess, yeah, the scene they were probably referring to was like at the time, 4th Avenue, I think was quite a hippie mecca,
Okay.
Vancouver.
Right.
And then also the Gulf Islands were attracting a lot of hippie colonies of one kind and another.
Right.
Is that the sort of thing you think they were referring to?
Could be. I really, you know, I never really asked.
Right. What is the scene of which you speak?
What are you talking about? You know, it's like, yeah, I don't know, because I just, my life was a little bit different, but anyway, it doesn't matter. Now, then you wrote another book, Utopian Experiments in British Columbia.
That's the subtitle of the first book.
That's
Yeah.
the same book. Okay.
The second book was Hollywood Utopia.
Okay.
So I was carrying on with the Utopia theme there, which I did for a while with various projects. So just to like maybe expand on that word a little bit, utopia was a word that was coined by a thinker from the Renaissance, Sir Thomas More, who wrote a book that was a playful description of what's understood to be an ideal commonwealth, an ideal place, an ideal society. Right. And that's where we get the word, is from his book, Utopia. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing about this word, though, is that like we understand it to mean an ideal place, right? Mm-hmm. But it also means it's kind of a pun in ancient Greek, which also means nowhere. So it means a good place, but it also means no place or nowhere. Right. So yeah, I think it was already built into the title, the idea that the perfect place doesn't exist. I think that's really what, he was going for there. Right, yeah. And he was inspired. Actually, his book was a parody of some of the travelogues that emerged in Europe after Europeans came into contact with America for the first time. Right. And a lot of people, because they kind of realized that there was this unknown, huge sort of space possibility, that they speculated that there could be almost anything out there, sort of including the literal Garden of Eden. Right. You probably heard the term, what's the term? The city of gold that the South Americans talked about, El Dorado. Oh, right. So El Dorado was a mythical city of gold that that European, like the Spanish, heard described in South America, but it turned out to be actually a literal story about a man covered in gold, like a kind of god that was right. that would become like a completely made of gold. And El Dorado means the golden one, actually. So I think there was kind of a misunderstanding there. But in any case, so they were hoping that there was like a city entirely made of gold, but it was actually just a story about a guy who, a god who is made of gold. Actually. Right. Okay. So we have like this idea connected to utopia that there could be any number of possibilities, any number of like amazing places. And indeed, there were many amazing places in the Americas. But what Sir Thomas More, he never went to, on a voyage himself, but he wrote his book to describe, an imaginary perfect place that was found in America, and somewhere in the Americas. Now, my book Hollywood Utopia is in a way it's similar to the first book in that it's a description of a bunch of different experimental communities. Yes. Only these were in Hollywood in the teens and 20s. Okay. So like, remember the idea that British Columbia is the California of Canada, yes. Right? Well, yes. California is like the California of America, right? California is like America on steroids or something. It's the place of discovery for the place of discovery. And interesting, like people, I researched this and I found that Hollywood, which was founded in the teens and around or even earlier, around 1909, was kind of just a little, it was a little retirement community originally, but the filmmakers went there because they had, at the time, because the cinema was in its infancy and photography in general was in its infancy, they needed a place where it was light all the time, so that they could shoot outdoor scenes inside. I mean, the other way around, indoor scenes outside. So they didn't have the kind of lights that people have today. So they went there for reasons, like quite practical reasons. Also, they went there because Thomas Edison, the inventor who actually, one of his inventions was the original movie camera. He had a patent out on the movie camera, and he used to, because people were stealing his designs, he used to hire gangsters to go around and smash people's movies up. And this was in the East Coast, where they were originally making the films, in New York and actually in Florida as well.
Right.
That was another reason why they decided to get far away as they could from Edison and his mobsters.
Spoons.
It's a very strange. So and also it was close to the Mexican border. That was another thing. So you could get away. Like, there were a lot of odd reasons why why these movie makers chose to found Hollywood in the place that they founded it.
Okay.
But there were a lot of in addition to this, there were a lot of rather odd and interesting communes and colonies and weird things that were developed in that era, in the teens and 20s, that were kind of unfamiliar to most people. Okay. So that's what that book is about.
Cool.
It's about.
Now, what is your strong interest with King James?
Well, it's kind of a jump, isn't it? Seems like. So when I was at university in Toronto, I specialized in the 17th century, which is the 1600s. And I was interested in Shakespeare and his period. I studied literature. Mm-hmm. Shakespeare died in the early part of the 1600s. And following that, there were a lot of very important events historically. There was a major series of civil wars. Then following that, we have things like the scientific revolution happening. And this century was just extremely, it was almost like the cusp of the modern world in a lot of respects. And so I was very interested in that century for those reasons. And I just love the literature and the history of that century. So I actually found myself going back to this earlier interest that I had in the last 5 years or so. So I in my first half of my career, I was kind of very focused on the theme of utopia, as I've described. And I also wrote a book about a novel about growing up as a little the child of hippies in Roberts Creek. And that was the book Spin the Bottle.
Oh, okay.
So I wrote it's kind of a comedy, sort of somewhat dark comedy, about being a child in that time when we were trying to, the hippies in the sort of latter part of their movement, they decided, because things were starting to go kind of weird, like you had, for example, the Manson family and people like that, started to ruin kind of the early excitement of the hippie scene, I guess. And they believed, for that and other reasons, that it was time to retreat from the city to the countryside. Mm-hmm. So in the early 70s, you had a lot of hippies, going to the country and trying to, and they called that the Back to the Land movement,
Okay.
which was, the idea was to be as self-sufficient as possible.
Right.
And so that was quite an adventure as well, that we actually did that. We went from when my mom, we had a kind of life of extremes, because at one stage we were living in Manhattan in the early 70s in quite a swanky neighborhood. And then events occurred in my mom's personal life, and we wound up back in Canada. And my mom decided that because she needed to write, and she wanted to be able to write her novels without too much, money, spending too much money, that this embracing this kind of simple life in the country, this Back to the Land movement was probably the best thing for us.
Okay.
So we lived in a cabin with no electricity and no plumbing at one stage. That was when I was like 9, 10, 11 at that stage. But it's kind of interesting, because today I have, I think, a better appreciation, more, I think, for like the kind of skills that we learned, making your own food.
Yeah.
You mentioned you were making a cake earlier. Well, these kinds of skills are things that a lot of people have lost, right? Because of the, availability of prepared food everywhere, which is one way is great, but in another way, what would we do if something goes wrong, if we get into a really bad scrape, right? We need to know how to make our food.
Exactly. I agree with you 100%.
So gardening, canning, herbal knowledge about what kind of herbs are growing in the forest. These were the sort of skills that one actually learned doing that, And so I went through a phase of really, I wasn't really happy with that scene, but then it was more because I think, that those sorts of skills and living in the countryside, those weren't the problems, really. The problems had more to do with, I think, with like family breakdown and the hippie scene
Yeah.
But the good side, was learning these kind of sense of independence and learning these skills that actually, we never know when we might have to.
Things that you don't unlearn.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, you don't unlearn them. And, these days we're hearing stuff about possible food shortages, fuel shortages. And, we've grown kind of a little bit over reliant on these kind of industrial processes. And I think it actually really is a good idea for people to learn as much as possible, these independent techniques.
I agree with you. The worst thing is like living in one of the worst things, in my opinion, is like living in an apartment. Like I'm in a condo, right? So you don't have the ability to just get out there and grow your own food. I mean, we have a small little gardening area, but you don't have that opportunity. And the grocery store is just down the street.
Yes, yeah. And on the one hand, that's great, it's so convenient and everything. But on the other hand, you kind of, you don't know if things go wrong, like,
where would you go? Like for somebody, if you're in a house and you still have a yard, you're okay in a way, right?
Yes.
That you still can grow some stuff. But in my case, like, where would I go? I mean, I think about things like that, and I grew up like, I was born in the 40s, so the late 40s. So, we had rabbit and we had lived on more off of the land than now. That's for darn sure. And my kids don't know that.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, if possible, it's, something that it's almost like we should be all sort of getting together and doing communal gardening sessions or something, because it really is important. And of course, in Canada, there's so much potential for that sort of gardening. Is it are you're all in the city, like are you in
Chilliwack? It's a small city, but like we do have a small little gardening area, but it's a ridiculous location on getting to it, because there's no access to it from inside the building. You have to go through one door, through one gate, through another gate, or go out the main door, go around the block. Like it's just the way that the place where it was put,
It's not the best design, it sounds like.
Well, it wasn't meant for that. It wasn't. It was just it belongs here, but there's a sewer system there that the city needs access to, and
Right.
and I used to call it the dead zone, because it was just a pile of weeds there. And so I mentioned it to council. Can we do some planting there?
Mhm.
Not
I see.
realizing that
Yeah.
yeah, not realizing what a pain in the to get to, right.
To get these permissions and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah.
I live in England now, in London, and we actually have a system that has been with us ever since the 1940s. During World War II, people did a lot of gardening because Britain had to be self-sufficient in that time, since the danger was like being cut off, essentially being cut off from trade, right?
Yes.
So at that time, the island was self-sufficient, and most of the food was coming from the island itself.
Yeah.
And they created this system of what's called allotments, and these are urban gardens, effectively.
Right. Yes.
So, I've seen similar things in Vancouver. They have urban gardens, and some of them along the railroad tracks and things like that. In Vancouver, you do have a bit of that.
Yeah,
but here it's really everywhere. Like you have it in every single area.
Yeah, we do have that here in Chilliwack. I know I just know of one location, downtown Chilliwack, right? And I think it's a great idea.
Can you apply to get a plot there? Is that how it works?
Yeah, yes, that's how it works. For me, I approached one time, talked to council. We're like, why do we have to have a lawn? Why don't we use it to plant food instead? But it didn't go over.
People want both, I guess.
Yeah,
a lawn and planting food. But yeah, it's I think that in the city, even though you're in the city, you can definitely find ways to adapt, and to grow food, even just if it's a little bit. Like my husband is a great gardener. We've got a nice garden out back. And he's right now, because it's harvest time, he's starting to bring in the cucumbers and tomatoes.
Yeah.
Blackberries actually we have a lot of blackberries too.
Yeah, they grow everywhere here too, so it's great. But now let's move on to talking more about King James, because we're gonna, I don't want to run out of time here. I'm just looking at my phone.
Yeah, I know, I went off on a detour.
Yeah, what attracted you to talk to want to get into working on his biography?
So King James was born in 1633 and he died in 1701. And people might be more familiar with his grandfather, James I, who succeeded Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth, the famous Queen Elizabeth I, who was the red hair and who was like alive. Shakespeare's life kind of crossed these two monarchs.
Okay.
His grandson, James II, very interesting figure, because the present British Constitution is kind of based on his having been deposed. So he was deposed in a revolution of sorts. It was kind of an elite. I would call it more like a coup than a real revolution, because it was an elite deposed him in favor of a relative who was the regent, the king of, kind of leader, let's say, of Holland. And the reasons were largely to do with the fact that the king converted to Catholicism. And at the time, there was a very, in England, there was the previous century, the English had, thanks to Henry VIII, had become officially Protestant.
Yeah.
And so there had been a lot of, struggles, unfortunate struggles between these two groups, Catholics and Protestants. Yeah. And the King James, through his own kind of private reasoning, he had come to the conviction that he wanted to be a Catholic, but it was actually before he even became king. He became a Catholic, and there was quite a bit of resistance to putting him on the throne because of that, for that reason. So there was quite a lot of bigotry actually against Catholics. And that was one thing that was kind of going against him. Now, he actually tried to introduce a toleration policy for all religions. And for the time, it was extraordinarily broad, because he included, there weren't many Jewish people or Muslims in Britain at that time, but in theory, it did include them as well. So it was all different types of Christians, including Quakers, quite, as Quakers they're not very orthodox, they're quite a small and kind of very specific kind of sect. Mm-hmm. So including kind of groups like that, but also the main sort of mainline Protestants, and then Catholics who were this kind of, I think a lot of the resistance to Catholics had to do with the fact that Britain had tensions with, like, say, France, which was a Catholic nation. And so the complication there had to do with politics as well as just religion itself.
Right. No surprise.
So people would think, like, oh, if we, have this Catholic king, then the French will, like, rule us somehow, or, this kind of thing would come into their calculation. But James, in 1687, he tried to introduce this policy of toleration that would include Catholics, but would also include these small Protestant groups that had also been restricted. Okay. The Church of England, the Anglican Church, was the official church, and they're a Protestant church, but very, actually, in a lot of ways, very similar to the Catholic churches in terms of their forms.
Right.
But so he tried to introduce this legislation that I guess a lot of people were not ready for. And he was deposed when he had a son, and they thought, okay, well, before that, he actually had Protestant heirs. So they thought that the throne would go to these Protestants. But then he had a son, and the son was going to be a Catholic. So at that point, this coup happened, right?
Okay.
So it's kind of, he's somebody who has kind of been swept under the rug a lot historically, because he was the actual king, and yet he was overthrown for kind of not the greatest reasons, right?
Yeah.
And he tends to be like, people are like, oh, him, let's not talk about him.
So you're talking about him.
Yeah, I'm talking about him. Yeah. So those are, so I have a YouTube channel called Justine Brown's Bookshelf, and on it, I've made a lot of videos about the 17th century in general. So a lot of them have to do with, and some about Utopia, and a little bit about art history as well. They're very heavily illustrated. So, if you're want to see some nice pictures, even just, check it out, because I usually add at least 100 illustrations to each one.
That sounds good. Yeah, we're running out of time. I just got a warning, like a Zoom.
Okay.
Well, it just doesn't beep, but it just shows up and is distracting. So we're going to have you on again. That's all there is to it.
But so much, only just got me started. No, I've covered a lot of ground.
Oh, okay. Well, just hold on then. I'm going to just say goodbye to the audience. Thank you for watching. You've been listening to Justine Brown. And as she said, she's got a YouTube channel, Justine Brown's Bookshelf. I think it would be interesting to check it out. So I hope you'll do that. And thanks for tuning in, everybody. And be nice and peace out.
A sense of community, Chilliwack's a place to be. A sense of community where you're free. Rolling through the mountains, rolling through the valley, rolling through paradise with me. It's multicultural, you're sure to see it all. Chilliwack's the place to be, you'll see. Come party in the park, go dancing after dark. Chilliwack's a place to be, you'll see.